Okay, hello again, everyone. Thank you for joining us in person and online for our second educational session for the night. My name is Henry Viscale, and I use he, him pronouns. I am a board member for Uniting Pride and also a PhD student at the University of Illinois in Human Development and Family Studies. And to those of you who are watching the recording in the future, welcome and thank you for being here with us again. A note to those of you who are watching live online, you can put your questions in the comments, either on Facebook or YouTube, as we're going throughout the panel tonight, and we'll have time at the end of the panel to answer those questions online. So tonight we'll be talking about two-spirit identities and the experiences of folks who identify as two-spirit. And we have a wonderful panel of folks with various schools of knowledge for us to learn from. So first we have Dr. Charlotte Davidson, the director of the Native American Cultural House at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Davidson, can you introduce yourself?
Ja, Charlotte Davidson Torglini Nishlan, Water Buster Clan Gushichi, Kitlachini Gushiche, Flintlock Clan Gashana. Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlotte Davidson. I am Diné and a citizen of the Mandan Hidatsa River Nation. And as Dane shared, I am the director of the Native American House.
And you can go ahead, and then on top of this,
on the top of the slide are my clans that I mentioned in the Diné language. Both of my mother's and my father's peoples, they come from matrilineal societies. So Torglini is the water flows together people. That's my mother's clan. My other salient identities are listed on the slide and include being a first-generation college student from a low socioeconomic background. I am now a first-generation higher education professional. I am a cisgender straight woman. I'm also a mother to Matthew and William, and a partner to Ryan Davidson. And I have to say that my children, I refer to them as these beautiful moccasin beings that once inhabited my belly, really were instrumental and continue to be vital to how I design my thinking about all types of topics and issues that pertain to Indigenous peoples. And I really give them a lot of credit in endowing me with a particular type of worldview and language to name and describe, these types of experiences and perspectives. In terms of my educational background, I am a proud alumna of Castle Indian Nations University, where I earned my BA in American Indian Studies, and I'm also a proud alumna of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where I earned both my master's and doctorate in educational policy studies.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Jenny Davis. Jenny is the director of the American Indian Studies program here at UIUC.
Hi everybody, I'm Jenny Davis. As Dave mentioned, I am the director of the American Indian Studies program here on campus. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and American Indian Studies. This is my 9th year on campus, which kind of sounds wild to say at this point. I am, in my introduction, one of the things I said was that I am from Oklahoma. I was born and raised in Oklahoma. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. And went to my undergrad at Oklahoma State and then graduate school at the University of Colorado and a number of other stops along the way before coming here. I am a Two-Spirit woman, and I have been involved with the Two-Spirit community and Two-Spirit activism for quite a long time now. I guess about a little over 2 decades. And so some of the things that I contributed were that in the early 2000s, in the mid-2000s, I was the co-director of the Denver Two-Spirit Society and the co-director of the Tulsa Two-Spirit Society after that. During my time in the Denver Two-Spirit Society, we hosted one of the international Two-Spirit gatherings, which are gatherings for Two-Spirit folks and allies that occur more or less annually and move back and forth, change in location and move back and forth between the US and Canada. So this two-spirit identity, how we negotiate our lives, what our lives are like. So it's kind of lived experience, it's a big part of my activism, and it's also a thing that is a part of my general research, where I am interested in things like language revitalization, in Indigenous language sharing, sexuality, and kinship, as well as other areas that are both directly and indirectly related.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Next, we have Jasper James Quinn Doney, a student here at UIUC.
Waxay nigdan aani nigdan nanisahit nihato Jasudoni nanisahit Watsanitdan Abisna Idiki Ni Nabana. Hello, I'm from Hayes. My white man name is Jasper Doney, and my Indian name is Lively Beaver, and it's good to see you here today. So, yeah, I received my associate's degree. I'm a transfer student from Montana, and I received my associate's degree in American Indian Studies. And I transferred here, and I'm a journalism major. And I am an Ani Min, but if you Google us, the term that won't show up. So due to assimilation and colonization, our name is called Robot, and that means thick belly, but it's a wrong term. I mean, it's a French term, and it was given to us during the first steps. But Ani Min is white people, and that's the tribe where I'm from.
Thank you all so much for your introductions. I think we're going to have a really awesome discussion tonight. We have lots of different experiences here and lots of different pools of knowledge that we're going to hear from. So why don't we dive in? So my first question is, two-spirit is a recent term from the 90s that is being used to refer to identities that have been present in indigenous nations since before Europeans began to colonize North America. So could you all explain a little about the history of two-spirit identities in indigenous communities? And whoever wants to start first, we're going to do a conversation, we can all talk together. Feel free to talk, however you feel comfortable.
Take a stab at that. So a couple of ways to slice it. What two-spirit represents is actually the fact that indigenous communities and indigenous societies have complex and robust gender and kinship and sexuality practices that do not line up and are not the same as Western European colonial practices. And so when we think about something like identity or a singular definition, it can actually be pretty hard to pin down, not just because of that, but because we're talking about, 700, even within just what is now the US, more than 700 nations, right? And distinct cultures and languages and practices. So the identities, the two-spirit identity in the term was to have a way of thinking about how we come together and what the similarities are. It was created by activists who were coming together around that type of activism. And so it's in English, in part because that is a lingua franca, shared language among the folks who are coming together, but also because we have our own terms within our own communities and languages, and those are still maintained for the most part, and it would be pretty weird for one of us or all of us to start just using someone else's terms for things, right? So it does something at a kind of macro level that is different than the ways that things operate within our own, specific to our own community. So that's where I will stop there.
Just to add on top of that, the emphasis is non-sexuality, but it's more towards spirituality gifts and traditional roles.
Thank you, Jasper and Jenny. What I'm going to offer is from a genetic standpoint, and I want to preface what I'm going to share, with you all this evening by recognizing that I only know this much, not only about this topic, but the world. One of my matrilineal relatives once expressed that to me, and he's a very well respected medicine person who's no longer an earth surface person. And he would express that to me and others that he was teaching, and he would say, I only know this much. And I would think, wow, he knows a lot, and if he knows that much, then I know even less. So I offered that as a way just to express my own, humility, and that I'm a learning-centered person, and just position myself in that way in relationship to this topic. So from the Dinesh standpoint, and what I've learned from my own Dinesh relatives is that within our own creation narratives as Dinesh people, we always had diverse gender relatives. That is not a new phenomenon for us. And the same grandfather once wrote in a book chapter on Dinesh perspectives, once wrote, colonizers insist that we be actors in their story. They don't want us to remain as actors in ours. So our creation narratives tell the story of how one time men and women were at odds with each other. And the people that were introduced by our holy people to restore harmony and balance were Naglehe. And Naglehe is the English translation would be one who constantly transforms. So these beings, these relatives, were often either feminine males or masculine females. And they've always had a unique ceremonial role in our community since time immemorial. And that one little snippet of the story demonstrates how they served as mediators. They restored harmony in that way, and they helped maintain, those relationships in a good way for our communities and for our nation.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. There's so much to unpack in that. Talking about colonization, talking about it not just being a gender or sexuality identity, but going back to spirituality, going back to creation and history, and tying lots of people together. And it's so different across the many nations that exist here. You were talking about, Dr. Davis, that it's not just one thing. It's many, many different origins, many different histories, and many different experiences that have been pushed to have to be one because of colonization. And just thank you so much for providing this background. And Charlotte, I think you brought up something that was talking about, you took on spiritual roles, like that people who identify as two-spirit took on spiritual roles and how they were in this high regard. I think that leads us into this second question that I have, which talks about historically that people who today, using the term two-spirit, who identified as two-spirit, and who were two-spirit, were often held in high regard, and traditionally participated in all roles instead of only ones for men or only ones for women. So what does it mean to identify as two-spirit today, and how hasn't the meaning of this identity changed in Indigenous communities? Brady, you would like to respond first.
Yeah, so the honor of being two-spirit in today's Indigenous community is still in the highest regard for the most part. So for me, for example, growing up, there wasn't a lot of two-spirit role models to really look up to because of the Christian fundamentalism that was being taught in our local schools and preachers. So, in the local schools and churches, it wasn't until recently there was a community of two-spirit individuals. So for me, I identify as a non-binary person who is also homosexual, but it was hard for me to accept who I was in the beginning. So, but it was the love that I received from a few members in the community that really helped me accept who I really was as a two-spirit person. So two-spirit in today's terminology is much different. It's much more open to use and much more common.
Thank you.
I think, again, from a Dinesh standpoint, unfortunately, a lot of Dinesh people, because they, some of them now center their origins within Western religion. Don't recognize that the presence of our two-spirited relatives, our not-elected relatives, are part of this ongoing creation narrative. And that is a disheartening thing to witness and to hear about. When I think about how this has changed, it's about, not adhering to our own traditional origins, our stories, not centering ourselves to see people as our holy people taught us to originally see each other. Because also in our creation narratives, it talks about our ancestors who traveled through a series of underworlds into this present world. And throughout that journey, our ancestors encountered adversity. And part of that journey involved them then being endowed with certain songs and ceremonies and peoples to restore that harmony, to promote these different concepts of kinship. And so we are taught then as Diné people to look to those origin stories to see how, being an agent of Peugeot and Ket, these concepts, these Diné concepts. Ket is the concept for kinship. Peugeot is the expression for beauty, balance, and harmony. We have a cultural obligation to be agents of Peugeot and Ket, and to position ourselves as a relative to all, and to center, who we are, to not compromise our cultural integrity, despite the ways in which colonization has inserted itself in a violent way into our creation narratives. And so that, because of colonization, people now really one another in a different way, in a dehumanizing way. And, that shapes or misshapes, malshapes their perception toward people and changes the way in which non-Black are engaged, are involved, are perceived in our communities.
Yeah, to follow up on that, so much was started by the work of colonial efforts, and that, it was not just, say, the gender systems into a binary gender system, it was also what are the appropriate behaviors for folks within that gender binary. It was the spiritual practices that people would have practiced, or anyone might have practiced. It was the language practices, right? So it actually was kind of a wholesale attack. And when we think about who we are in our relationality with folks, it plays into all of those elements. And so I think the impact on those things onto how folks who we would put under the umbrella of Two-Spirit were viewed had did dramatic shift over time. Again, it varies by community, by how long things like colonialism and Christianity and other things have been in the community, and which and who came by first and stayed longest and those kinds of things. So it varies. In terms of the Indigenous communities, when I think about the kind of activism from the 90s on, I've been able to see some major shifts in Indigenous communities in terms of, again, I think it's connected to things like language reclamation and spiritual reclamation, where there is a kind of greater conversation and support for Two-Spirit folks, not universal, but a shift, so that you now have communities that will have kind of contemporary takes on things like pride parades or Two-Spirit powwows, where, so for example, the first kind of intertribal Two-Spirit powwow in the U.S. at least was in San Francisco, and originally that was a very small powwow, and now it's just one of the powwows on the powwow circuit for the spring that people are attending, and you have community members who are coming not because they identify as Two-Spirit or because they're there to support family, but because this is a community powwow and they go to community powwows, right? And so I think I've seen that pretty broadly, a shift in that direction. Communities that are having conversations around what it means to, I think, in thinking about making events and welcome space for Two-Spirit people, also really digging into what those traditional practices are and what it looks like or how it's moving. And that includes thinking about things like powwow categories or how music is referred to, these sorts of things. So, so universal, I think there is sort of a long way to go in a lot of our communities, but there definitely has been a shift since the kind of wide-scale activism that started in the 60s and then had a big growth in the 90s as well.
As you were talking, Davis, I was wondering, since this is part of your research area, this is you identify as a Two-Spirit person, and I was wondering what the research has said about for people who do identify as Two-Spirit. What have been some like roadblocks or some things that have helped them feel more validated, things that have been kind of like you said, roadblocks for them as they are coming to terms with this identity?
Yeah, I would say roadblocks are that Two-Spirit folks face multiple marginalizations. So there's marginalization along being an Indigenous person and the systematic racism that comes along with that. And so that's going to be a lived reality at all times. And then there's the kind of marginalization or stereotypes that come with being someone who's, categorized within a kind of queer umbrella. And so that often means that folks are never totally feel like comfortable or welcome, right? Or kind of always a little bit at odds. So, if you're at home with Native folks, then you stand out because you're Two-Spirit. And if you're with queer folks in what is a often very predominantly white space, then you stand out because you're Indigenous. And then a lot of there's impacts of structural racism and transphobia, homophobia, all of those things, right? That mean that it's hard to get a job and to express yourself. It's hard to get housing. It's hard to wait. So a number of those things are kind of multiplied, as we see with a lot of communities that have that kind of full marginalization. I think people often speak to having some kind of support network. And sometimes that's within their home communities. A lot of the Two-Spirit societies that formed the 60s through now were created predominantly in urban spaces where people came together, and they're multi-tribal spaces. And those are different spaces that do different things, and they are common across a lot of ways of organizing ourselves. Where we come together, Native American House, for example, is where we come together across multiple tribes and find support and find community. And so I think the availability of those kinds of spaces is usually what for folks makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. Davidson and Jasper, from the perspective of this isn't your research topic, but it's just like being an ally and being lived experience. How can you how do you find these spaces that are supportive? What are ways that we can help create more supportive spaces as allies or as other members of the queer community who want to be allies of people who are Two-Spirit?
Well, at the Native American House, one of the things that myself and my staff strive to model is being a good relative. That's an ancestral concept, it's an ancestral beingness, and I also share with staff that, we need a model that way. For students, for the larger campus community, and I often liken the Native American House to in that traditional home place, which is the hogan. And when I describe it, I often reference it as a wood-based space. You know, the top of the roof is round. It's made from, you know, the earth, and it's meant to embody the belly of a woman carrying a child. So when you go into that space, you know, you're gonna feel loved, you're gonna feel nurtured, you're gonna feel whole. It's not designed to be a space where people experience oppression. You're not gonna be racialized. You're not gonna experience violence. None of that should exist in that space. So in a sense, I'm asking the staff and the students to help create that kind of wound-based atmosphere, not just for the Native higher education community, but for all peoples. This is a space where people can be safe, where the Native American house, but, you know, we have a people first mindset. You know, it goes back to that notion of, you know, being relationship based. And again, positioning ourselves as a relative to all. Everybody has a place at that location.
Yeah, just to follow up with her, so for starters, you guys are here to learn more about our history and our experiences as two-spirit persons, and after the start, I'd like to thank you for that, because not a lot of people in today's society are interested or even care about anything Indigenous related. So just learning the history and the meaning and the variety of identities is a way of being an ally. And for me, since I identify as non-binary, just asking what my pronouns are tells me that you are respected.
Awesome, thank you all so much. I think I wanted to have something you said, Art, because in the very beginning, you said you know about this much about the world, and I am in that same boat with being here today. I am here as an ally, and I am here to learn more. And I think one of the things that people who do want to be here as allies, people who do want to step up and defend and step up and be advocates for people who are two-spirit and who are part of the Indigenous community is, like, there are lots of definitions that people apply to people who are two-spirit who they give stereotypes. They say it's a gender identity, they say it's a sexual identity, and we've learned already tonight that it's a spirit identity. It's much more personal, and it doesn't have to do with specific gender or specific sexuality identities. So what are some other common misconceptions about two-spirit individuals that we can start to dispel and we can start to learn more about tonight?
I think one of the things that is true of the things you just said is that often there's a kind of a problem that arises when two-spirit is trying to, well, one, explaining it in English, right? Generalizing across communities. But you know, the debates about is this a thing about gender, and is it the same thing as XY gender identity? Is it a sexuality, and is this, you know, a right? That one, those are not uncomplicated when we think about them in like Western Europe, right? It's not that they're all distinct from each other and not related. But I think that it's often trying to make them line up with a non-Indigenous framework. And I think that that's always going to get in trouble because we are the same, right? And so, an ability to have to just allow there to be different concepts that don't necessarily have to line up, I think is helpful. I think some of the misconceptions can be related to misconceptions people have about Native people in general, right? In general, so they might have thoughts about what an authentic Native person looks like, and then what an authentic two-spirit person looks like. And so I do think a lot of those questions come up when people are trying to figure out who's real and not real, right? And so I think some of that, well, it's not for outsiders to decide who's authentically Native or not, but also that's not really a helpful framework to be talking about in terms Indigenous spirit.
So I think one of the things that I often hear from relatives is, not like that, they're not bringing chaos or introducing chaos and disharmony to our communities, to the world. And once again, migration stories express that. It's the opposite. They help us restore harmony. They help us restore balance. So I think, we can't, re-emphasize and repeat that truth enough.
I think another challenge also comes from stigmatizing from the Christian fundamentalist teachings and preachers. Most of the challenge comes from the Christian fundamentalist beliefs and slurs, like if you're gay, you're going to hell, or being gay is a sin, because being two-spirit is more than gender identity. It's an alternative gender status for also for the special case.
Thank you all so much. You touched on a lot of topics that have all pretty much go back to colonialism and with to whiteness and to heteronormativity, homonormativity, cisnormativity, all these different macro level systemic oppressions that are put onto people who don't fall within a certain gender, sexuality, or race category that is privileged above everything else. And it's really important to start calling those out and to be aware of those as people who want to be allies. And I really appreciate you just calling them out and saying that those are the things that we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of whiteness, we need to be aware of dominant Christian religion and how that is affecting the way that we see and classify people. I think the next question that I would like to ask you all is, how have current anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans legislations affected people who identify as two-spirit?
For the Diné Nation, for example, they have the Diné Marriage Act of 2005, which prohibits same-sex marriages. And again, what I hear from relatives is, but we're Diné. Nowhere in our teachings and in our Christian narratives was there ever a story about that union occurs between, specific people. Because, love is expressed in multiple ways, that being one, bringing two families, two people together as one. And that was part of our teachings. But as my colleagues here have shared, that's our ways are often decentered. And then, what gets centered is often, Western religious ways of perceiving, a union, our relationship, our partnership between human beings. So I would say that's definitely, remains an issue, a challenge.
I would say that, I think, we comfortable saying that, in terms of the anti-LGBTQ or anti-trans legislation, that those always disproportionately impact BIPOC folks more broadly. And so Indigenous people would be in the groups of folks, again, who already face higher levels of violence, who already, hate-based violence, who already face greater, inability to find housing, to have good medical care. And so any of these, pieces of legislation that are being put out are going to disproportionately affect folks. So if they, going to the medical facilities as an Indigenous person is already going to be a challenging experience. And so if medical professionals are either allowed or forced to behave in ways that do not affirm identities, and these kinds of laws are never acknowledging and recognizing that is a diversity of cultures and histories and identities, right, that are all equally valued and should be upheld. And so in those ways, Two-Spirit people are always going to be the most impacted. In the same way that LGBTQ and trans affirming actions are all going to benefit everybody, right? Everybody is impacted by these, but not to the same degree. And so I would say, again, the whole marginalization status, because of the ways that Two-Spirit people already experience things at higher levels than I guess the members of other areas, and then it kind of connects to things like access to socioeconomic stability, right? There's a lot of pieces that always kind of pile on that make it so that these are always going to affect Two-Spirit people more than folks who aren't.
Anything else anyone else would like to add?
Yeah, sorry. I'm just thinking or looking at it in today's society. So the only scare that I see, in my opinion, should be the overturning of the Roe v. Wade decision because it's under the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment also guarantees the right to privacy, and therefore, further legislation could affect same-sex marriage and the right to choose your identity and who you are and who you love. That's just basically that's who you are as a Two-Spirit person.
Yeah, it's attacking multiple levels of marginalization. Like you're talking about, Davis, it's intersectionality at the core, and how we have kept talking about systemic oppressions. It's thank you so much. It's been very enlightening to hear all of this. Talk about and to be educated myself as someone I'm just a white cisgender gay man, and I know this much about anything, and because of my identities, and I don't have the experiences of someone who is Indigenous or experience of someone who isn't like having these experiences. So thank you so much. It's been really enlightening. I think right now would be a great time to turn to the audience. Nicole, if there are any questions online, feel free to shout them out, or we can go to the questions in person if anyone has any questions. Yes.
You could just shout it out.
So, as you all have been talking, I've been reminded of theorizing from the borderlands on Salduo's work, and I'm thinking about how the word queer and all of these ideas of queerness, clearly does not translate outside of English. And I'm wondering, I've always just assumed that using the term queer is inclusive of Two-Spirit people and people's experiences and identities. So I'm wondering if there's a conversation about whether or not that is an appropriate term or an affirming term, and what level of comfort there is with this Western idea of queerness to represent Two-Spirit people's experiences as well.
Well, I would say that there are probably as many different answers to that as there are Two-Spirit folks, so I can think against how I see those conversations happening. I mean, I will say, the way that queer has historically and in contemporary ways been represented and is often discussed is kind of as a default to whiteness and as whiteness. And so even though that's never been the case within the identities and activism and places. And so I think just as people may or may not also identify as Two-Spirit and with many of the other pieces of the acronym, I think queer does things and allows us to do certain things. I think it's also inadequate in ways. And so I think we will see people, shorthand might be that the definition of Two-Spirit is a queer native, right? Someone might get that as an answer. Obviously, it can be unpacked for a long period of time. And so I think there are places where people will do it and probably to some degree always doing it strategically, right? And so listening to the ways that it doesn't work and doesn't function, and maybe even the multiplicity of definitions and meanings it has what happens when it's translated into other languages, English and pronunciation, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think, activism within Two-Spirit community or Two-Spirit societies is often seen as kind of having multiple places where the work is done, and one of it is with the kind of mainstream queer community, and part of it is with our local home communities, and then part of it is broad public. But those are often understood to be quite separate spaces, and so, yeah, again, I know people who that would be the kind of first part of the byline, and other folks for whom that term would never be a thing they would have thought of themselves. So, I think it is, even in the definition where you have to always put Indigenous in with the queer, right, is a way to frame that as an inseparable way to understand. So, I don't know if that's a bit.
Yeah, I would just add briefly, I have a really good colleague who's really my little brother, and he identifies as indigenous queer. And, he belongs to 2 different Native nations. So that's a way, he said it's a nice way for him to recognize kind of like the different forms in which that may show up in these 2 distinct nations.
Thank you for that question. I think that kind of made me think about trying to gather my words, because you said something that was really interesting, how queer can be really good, but also really bad. It's like that at the same time. I'm reframing your words, not trying to say you think that, but that's how I was understanding it, and how it means different things in different languages and different nations and different experiences of understanding. And it just goes to show how when, like, we're trying to be inclusive, it's still like Western centered. It's still centered in the way that we understand when we are trying to be inclusive, and how we need to pay attention to the language that we're using, even when we're attempting to create more inclusive language, to make sure that we are addressing all avenues of inclusivity, to make sure we are using it in a way that is still not offensive and still not pushing whiteness or pushing colonization onto members of different communities or members of different experiences. Thank you so much. It was really enlightening. Are there any other questions? Yes.
So there are many different native nations. I'm wondering if there are any nuanced differences among different tribes. Do they have different understanding towards Two-Spirit, or is there a division among the understanding or competing understanding towards the word or towards the culture Two-Spirit among the different tribes?
Yeah, so actually there's a great deal of variety about, again, because it's essentially what doesn't quite fit well, right? What is different from a gender binary, cisgender, kind of heteronormative, but also a very particular family structure, a very particular way of raising children in a kind of family structure that, right, with the nuclear family model. And so there are Indigenous communities that have 4 or 5 genders, right? There are Indigenous communities for whom this is connected more to the roles of someone who might be seen as a combination of 2 or a separate one. And I will also say that as with humanity, right, there are, within a given community, there are different ways that people embody those things. It's not that everyone who might be identified as a co-worker or employee, right, if they're the exact same person and do things the exact same way, right, that there's a lot of variety within a person's lifetime. We have different roles and responsibilities and types of relationality that we have within our own lifetimes, and that's going to be true of folks that would fall into that umbrella as well. So there's not just diversity across the different communities, but also I would say over time and within the community and even within individuals over time. So that's why it's really hard to give a tidy answer. to what it means or what it would look like, and that's why there's often such a range of who identifies within this umbrella and what it looks like in their day-to-day life, right? Or what it would mean to look at individuals from past moments from our histories who would have been potentially categorized under this umbrella, right? Because again, it's going to look very different depending on who they are, and you know, our roles and responsibilities vary not only at how old are we, but what family and clan are we from, what professions do we take on, all of those things, right? So it has the same kind of diversity that all other aspects of the human culture and practice do. That's my anthropologist answer, I'm sorry.
Anyone else like to add to that? Okay, sweet. Is there any other questions?
I have a follow-up to my question. We're gonna take a bit more time, but one of the things you said, Dr. Davis, is that there's sort of multiple levels of activism and advocacy going on. One in the sort of the mainstream queer community, queer activism, and then another in home nations or home cultures. And I'm wondering to what extent that's intentional and protective and, you know, beneficial, or to what extent it's a byproduct of the lack of ability for representation, or the lack of representation in those mainstream queer spaces.
Yeah, I think it's by necessity. I think it's by a recognition that there are ways that the larger, broader community is doing work that connects to and impacts the lives of two-spirit people. So that there are limits to it and places for it to grow and become better. And then the kind of home community dynamics, right, are necessary in places where things could either be recognized and supported, or you know, or again under processes of like revitalization, how can they shift back or shift forward those things. So I think the different, it's just, you know, I think two-spirit people don't get to just choose one place to do activism, because all of those spaces impact our lives. And so you gotta kind of try to do a little of everything to the degree that it's possible.
Anyone else? Yes.
I guess, to what extent, because I was thinking about how a lot of tribes didn't used to have powwows, but then became part of like the pan-Indian movement, and they tried to just incorporate that. To what extent has that like, I'm sure that as much as many tribes have like 3, 4, 5 genders, then maybe some others just didn't, and then has there been any like spillover of the two-spirit idea to the tribes that didn't used to have that? Like has it become more of like a pan-Indian?
I think pan-Indian doesn't, so within the two-spirit, most spaces, so pan-Indian are raising distinctions within tribes. And I would say most of the spaces, either within our communities or those multi-tribal spaces, really that the tribal distinction is really important. So you would say first who you are, and then kind of how you identify those types of things. I don't know that it's just whether how many genders are set up within the system. It's also, was it patriarchal? Was it, what are the norms around sexual practices, reproduction, kinship, relationality? All of those were different within Indigenous communities than you know, settler colonial practices. And so there would have been identities, again, not one-to-one correlation with LGBT or Q, but plenty of ways where the current models of how and who you can be don't quite line up with the practices within Indigenous communities. I think a lot of people even if they aren't sure in their own communities, or their communities don't have those practices still at the front, spend a lot of time and are encouraged to find those out. So if they don't know, it's kind of, okay, let's find out what those would be. Let's figure out within our own cultures and communities. Because it wouldn't be, I don't think it would be very well received to talk about oneself and to take up practices that don't make sense for your community. So I would say even within powwow culture, you usually have to say who brought you in to dancing, and how you were trained, and so who taught you, who gave you permission, those kinds of things. And so there would be the same kinds of questions asked, right? So like, why are you taking this up? Why are you presenting yourself in this way, kind of thing? And you would need to say how you came into those practices. So the cultural part of outputs at the tribal levels are still practiced for the most part. Now I can't say for everyone everywhere, but I mean, even powwows have spread, and multi-tribal, intertribal powwows are definitely a product of various kinds of relocations and interactions, but they also have very specific protocols and regional dynamics. So I would say those are also true within a multi-tribal space. And so, for example, you wouldn't identify as Two-Spirit and not know who your tribe was, right? Because you're always kind of pulling back on who your community is and who you are in order to understand what that identity is. So that might vary depending on the space. Very true for Oklahoma, very true for Denver, and Chicago as well, I think. So maybe not as
Are there any other questions in these last 5 minutes? Yes, Anissa.
How might native Two-Spirit spirituality be in conversation with indigenous spiritualities in terms of maybe, for example, other indigenous cultures around the world having been affected by colonization? We've also had so-called folklore about diverse gendered mentors, higher powers, teachers, and so I don't know. I guess my question is, how might all of that be in conversation?
Okay, so I will say, like, at things like international gatherings and Two-Spirit powwows, there are folks that come from indigenous communities outside of just the US, or, so we have definitely a kind of continental and Two-Spirit approach where people are, again, recognizing sufficient similarity under colonialism is how I would frame it, right? So I do think there's an interest in those kinds of conversations in the same way that there's an interest in conversation across indigenous folks and globally. Wanting to find out how things work in other people's communities, and again, what is the language, what is the practice, what is the, so it's the San Francisco powwow always includes folks from the local tribes as the kind of host communities, and then it involves folks from the indigenous Latin American communities, both that are present and have been present in California for a long time, and folks that are coming in from those locations for that event. They're coming in from Mexico and Central America and all over the places. So, and you have occasionally folks that are coming in from Hawaii or New Zealand, or this is their conversation. So I think it does happen, and I think it's very similar to the ways that we come together in conversation across our own tribal nations, right? So the Dene have different histories and regions and cultural practices than the Chickasaw, and we kind of get to know each other and come together across those differences and similarities. And I think it's very similar kind of at a scalar level with communities from other geographies and spaces.
Awesome. Well, in these last 4 minutes, I want to just point out that there is an American Indian culture exhibit happening right now at Spurlock. And so that's another way for us all to be educating ourselves and learning about the culture of Indigenous peoples here in the Americas. But as Director of the Culture House, Director of American Indian Studies, and as a student here who is learning still, what are other programs that are being offered this month or later this semester that we could come to learn more about American Indian culture?
Well, at the Native American House, we have a series of events that will be posted at the Night Auditorium on Monday, October 10th, and that is Indigenous Peoples Day. So we have a powwow performance company coming in from Chicago who will help spur that day of events. That will be followed by a presentation by a faculty member in the Department of History who will present on Indigenous Illinois. That will be followed by a lunch break, and the final presentation will really be about Indigenous perceptions of place and belonging. And Dr. Davis will be a part of that panel discussion later that day. From 2 to 4 at the Native American House will be a pop-up library featuring 10 books you want to read for Indigenous Peoples Day. Later that evening, I believe at 5 or so, University Housing is hosting a viewing of a documentary called Gather. So a couple of books from the Native higher education community will be part of that panel discussion regarding that particular documentary. We also are in the midst of planning for Native American Heritage Month. We also have a Dinner on Us series, which is a bi-weekly scholarly-led, practitioner-led workshop series that happens from 5 to 6. We just had our second Dinner on Us program yesterday where we hosted Dr. Jennifer Johnson, who is a citizen of the Seminole Nation, and she spoke about her research, which centers on Seminole educational sovereignty. So a lot of our information we promote through Facebook and Instagram. We're working on reactivating our listserv. You can always reach out to any one of us on email. Our emails are listed on the Native American House website for more information. Our website, I have to say, is undergoing reconstruction right now. So we're building, updating the content that is listed on the site right now. We're going to have lots of really cool things and events happening in the semester into the spring.
Thank you so much.
There are various events, so also on Indigenous Peoples Day, there will be a conversation with the new Associate Vice Chancellor of Native Affairs, Dr. Jackie Brand, in the floor, in the afternoon, and it will be at the Humanities Research Institute, which is Levis. So yeah, I think for folks who are interested in American Indian Studies offers a range of courses at the undergraduate and graduate level. Some of them are kind of introductory, so Intro to American Indian Studies is a great place to start and go all the way up. And you know, there are range often around disciplines you might be working in already. So you know, history, literature, anthropology, and then we do host talks. Usually those are posted on our webpage. So there will be a number in the spring, particularly various areas and guests who talks in the area of Indigenous science, and then some of the work at the intersections of legal studies and Indigenous literature. So those talks are always open to the public and open to folks on campus, and we always be excited to have you there. So you know, 1 hour commitments to semester commitments, I think, are kind of range.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Can we get a round of applause for our panel? check out the rest of the Pride events on the United Pride's website.